Today we are going to start finding inverses. So in order to find an inverse, all you do is you switch your x and your y. Okay, so your x value you will turn into a y, and your y value you will turn into an x. Okay, remember h of x or b of x or p of x or whatever, that's the same thing as y. Okay, then once you've switched those two, you're going to solve for y. You write your answer at the end as if it was h of x, you'll write it as h with a little -1 of x. That stands for the inverse. So a few things, function families and their inverses. So if you have a linear function, remember linear is y equals mx plus b, its inverse will also be linear. If you have a quadratic, so anything with an x squared, the inverse will end up being a square root graph, so square root of x. A cubic, y equals x cubed, its inverse is a cube root. And an exponential, which we'll get into more detail tomorrow, y equals b raised to the x, the inverse is a logarithmic equation, log base b of x equals y. Okay, so for number 1, we're going to practice solving f of x equals 2x minus 4. So we want to find the inverse. So again, first thing we do is we take our x value and we put it in y spot. So f of x becomes x. And our f of x, right, became x, and our 2x, that x becomes a y, so 2y. So those two just switch spots. Now we have x equals 2y minus 4. We're going to go through the steps to solve for y. So the first thing I've done here, zoom in a little bit, first thing I've done here is I've added 4 to both sides to isolate that 2y. So now I have x plus 4 is equal to 2 times y. So what's the opposite of timesing by 2? Dividing by 2. So we divide both sides by 2. So then I just have that x plus 4, I'm going to just leave it like that, all divided by 2, is equal to y. Now remember, I replaced that y back to f inverse of x. Okay, so remember our first one was a line, it was a linear function. And our inverse of a linear function is also a linear function. For our second example, we have g of x is equal to x over 3 plus 1. Okay, so this is just an x, it's not an x squared, it's not an x cubed, it's not being raised to the x, so again we have another linear function. So what do I need to do? I need to switch x and y. So this x over here moves over here to the g of x, and this g of x over here becomes a y and moves over here into x's spot. So make sure you're okay with that first step of switching your x and your y. Now we're going to go through the steps to solve for that y. So we have y divided by 3 plus 1. So first thing we're going to go ahead and do is get rid of that plus 1. So we're going to subtract 1 from both sides. So then I have x minus 1 is equal to y divided by 3. Now what's the opposite of dividing by 3? Multiplying by 3. So we multiply both sides by 3. So that's going to cancel our 3 over here, and we're going to multiply the x minus 1 by 3. So you can see here I just left it as 3 times x minus 1, okay, is equal to y, but instead of putting y, I had g of x originally, so I simply write it as g inverse of x is equal to 3 times x minus 1. If you wanted to distribute and make that 3x minus 3, you could, but you don't have to. And the inverse of a linear, remember, is again a linear. So, lines. Okay, now for example 3, we have h of x is equal to 2 times the quantity x squared minus 4. Okay, so first of all, we have an x squared. So anytime we have an x squared, what is our function family? That's a quadratic or a parabola. So I'm going to switch my x and y. So my x over here moves over to the other side and replaces that h of x. And that h of x goes away, and that x squared on the right becomes a y squared. So I have x is equal to 2 times the quantity y squared minus 4. So I could distribute that 2 if I wanted to, but it's a lot easier to get rid of it instead, because we're trying to solve for y. So to get rid of timesing by 2, we're going to divide everything by 2. So if I take x divided by 2, it comes over here. And on the right side, that 2's cancel, so I'm just left with y squared minus 4. Now I still need to get that y alone, so y squared minus 4, the opposite of minusing 4 is adding 4. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides. Okay, don't overly complicate things, just leave it as x over 2 plus 4 is equal to, what's left on the right, y squared. So what's the opposite of squaring something? Square rooting. So to get rid of that square, I square root both sides. So I'm just going to leave that x2 plus 4 under the square root over here is equal to, I'm left with just y on the right because the square and square root cancel. So it was h of x to begin with, so I just write it as h inverse of x. So you can use your chart with your function family, or obviously here we had a quadratic to start with, it was an x squared, and now we have a square root. So our family is just the square root family. And our fourth example, f of x is equal to 2 times the square root of x divided by 3. So again, what's our function family? We've got a square root there, so it's square root. So we're going to switch our x and our y. So our x was over here, it moves to the left and replaces that f of x. That f of x over here goes away, and that x on the right becomes a y. X is equal to 2 times the square root of y divided by 3. So we want to get rid of that timesing by 2. So the opposite of timesing by 2 is dividing by 2. So I have x divided by 2 on the left, and the 2's cancel on the right, so I'm just left with the square root of y divided by 3. Now how do I get rid of a square root? I must square both sides. So if I square over here and square over here, the square and the square root cancel on the right, so I'm just left with y divided by 3. And on the left, I'm going to go ahead and just take that x over 2 and square it and leave it like that. Now our next step is we have y divided by 3. So we have to get rid of that divided by 3. So what do? We multiply both sides by 3. So if I multiply the right by 3, it cancels. And I multiply the left by 3, and I just leave it as 3 times x divided by 2 squared. I'm left with just y on the right, so I take that y and I change it back into, it was f of x originally, so I change it to f inverse of x. And we have an x squared here, so what type of function is it? It is a quadratic. And now we have 2 more examples here on the next page. Okay. So here I have g of x is equal to the cube root of x plus 2. So what's my function family? Cube root is this guy right here. Okay, so again, switch my x and y. So this x moves over here to the left. My g of x is replaced with an x. And my g of x goes away. And my x on the right becomes a y. Now I need to solve. So x is equal to the cube root of y plus 2. So I need to get that y alone. So I get rid of the plus 2 by minusing 2. So I'm left with x minus 2 is equal to the cube root of y. Now, to get rid of a square root, we square. So to get rid of a cube root, we cube everything. So if I cube it on the right, it goes away, and I just take that x minus 2 cubed over here. I just leave it as the quantity x minus 2 cubed. We don't need to multiply it all out, is equal to, originally we had g of x, so we do g inverse of x. Our inverse function is the quantity x minus 2 cubed. So since it's cubed, our function family is a cubic. And for our last example, we have h of x is equal to 3x cubed minus 2. So what's our function family? X is cubed, so it's a cubic. I take my x and I flip it over to the other side. My h of x becomes x. My h of x over here goes away, and on the right that 3x cubed becomes 3y cubed. And now I solve. So 3y cubed minus 3. To isolate that y, we have to first get rid of the negative 2. So I add 2 to both sides. So we're just left with x plus 2 on the left. And on the right, we just have 3y cubed. So I first need to get rid of the 3 times the y cubed. So it's the opposite of timesing, dividing. So I divide everything by 3. So we'll just leave it as that quantity x plus 2 divided by 3. And on the right, that 3 got canceled, and we just have y cubed. And lastly, if it was y squared, we'd square root. Since it's y cubed, we cube root both sides. So when we cube root over here, it cancels, and then we'll just cube root over here, and we're left with a cube root of the quantity x plus 2 divided by 3 is equal to, we started with h of x, so we write h inverse of x, our inverse function. What is our function family? Again, since it's cube rooted, we've got the cube root over here, it's the cube root function family. And that is all for today.